already?
If you want, you prefer to here.
Je me décale.
Parce que là, ça engage des.
Yeah, it's up to you. It's really the organization of the yeah, exactly. That was also.
Les autres dimensions aussi. Focus is not really good. Ça va, j'avais difficulté à pas me.
So JT,
It's
you are right there. So stay on the screen, left side.
Ouais, je suis en train de l'ajuster.
Is that okay?
Please.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you everybody for showing up. We are welcoming JT, Jonathan Tsay, born and raised a little bit like the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air in Philadelphia, except JT was born from Taiwanese parents, so he went back to Taiwan for a while. But the reason why he's here is that he's been studying the role of multiple factors, including sensory and cognitive factors, on the control of movement and learning or adaptation. And so JT studied in Chicago, the house of Michael Jordan, but he didn't choose a basketball career, and we are very happy that he will speak about mostly reaching arm movements and how they are controlled. So you have a PT, so kinesiotherapy diploma. But before having this diploma, he studied math and then studied psychology or cognitive neuroscience in Berkeley. And now he got a position in the beautiful city of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. So congratulations, JT. Thank you for coming up in Marseille. I think I do have a gift. It's an umbrella, and as you can see, we are trying to get rid of this because it's always like this outside. So you use it. So right now, JT is spending his year in England. I hope you don't need it, but we want you. So
Yes, it's written here from the lab.
we don't use it. I don't know why we have this, but
I'll use it.
it's probably for giveaways. So thank you, JT, for showing up, and we are very happy to have you. Go ahead.
Thanks, Fabrice, for inviting me, and thank you everyone for coming today. Before I begin, I am very open to questions throughout the talk, so feel free to interrupt me if something's not clear, and I like to keep things very interactive. So as Fabrice mentioned, I wanted to tell you a little bit more about my background and how I went into different phases of my career so far. So I was born in Philadelphia, but I spent most of my life in Taiwan. And I played a lot of basketball. And I love basketball. I thought I wanted to be an NBA star. But sorry? Yeah, like Jeremy Lin, exactly. But during that time, I also developed an early interest in math and science. So when I went to Northwestern University in Chicago, I reasoned that I wanted to study math because it provides a solid foundation for science. If I wanted to go into biology, physics, or chemistry, I could be very, very adaptable. But during my third year of uni, I realized that I wanted to use math and science to help people. And I realized that when I was a basketball player, I had a great physiotherapist. And they used science and math, and they really used it to make tangible differences in people's lives. And that was when I decided to pursue a doctorate of physical therapy degree at Northwestern University. In America, physiotherapy is 3 years after your uni. I think here is your uni, if I'm correct. But so during my physical therapy degree, I was doing a lot of rotations through the ICU, through sports clinics. But then that was when I did my rotation at the neuro rehab hospital, working with people with stroke, Parkinson's disease, and similar to Najib. And that's when I became fascinated about how the brain controlled movement. So during the last year of my physical therapy degree, I applied to do a PhD in psychology to better understand how the brain controls movement. And since then, my research has focused on pretty much a singular question: how do humans acquire, adapt, and retain motor skills? And so to answer this question, I've asked things like, how do different practice schedules impact motor skill acquisition? Should you practice everything at once, or should you practice different skills one at a time? How is motor learning disrupted by rapid changes in the environment? For example, if you're playing basketball and suddenly there's wind, how does that affect the way you learn movements? I've asked how sensory uncertainty modulates motor learning. For example, if you're playing basketball on a foggy day or at night when you can't really see where the ball's going, how does that affect motor learning? I've asked how is the role of subcortical structures play during motor learning? For example, the cerebellum, for example, the basal ganglia. How do they affect and optimize your ability to learn new skills? And I've also asked what is the optimal time to provide feedback? Is it throughout the movement? Is it before the movement? Or is it after the movement? And surprisingly, we found that the best time to provide feedback is actually right at movement initiation. And I'm happy to elaborate on that during the Q&A. But today, I want to focus on what I see to be my 3 main contributions. The first is the role of proprioception in motor adaptation. The second is the cerebellum's role in coordinating movement and maybe even coordinating our thoughts. And lastly is the power of online data to study motor learning. I hear some people in the audience also do a lot of online experiments, so I want to share a little bit about that. And the methods I've been using have been mainly computational modeling, patient neuropsychology, and also large data machine learning. So again, interrupt me anytime if you have any questions, but I'm going to first dive into the role of proprioception of motor adaptation. So what is motor adaptation? Well, motor adaptation is the process of reducing our movement errors, the errors in our movement. And to illustrate what motor adaptation is, I want to show you a video of motor adaptation in real life. So motor adaptation is the process of reducing motor errors. And I love this video for a variety of reasons, but one of them is that it shows how motor adaptation is supported by multiple learning processes. Implicit adaptation helps us reduce these errors automatically, subconsciously, just through trial and error, but also explicit strategies through coaching, through instruction, help us quickly and flexibly reduce these errors. When I first joined the lab during my PhD at Berkeley, I was fascinated about the mechanisms that support implicit adaptation, how we subconsciously reduce these errors. So in order to study this and the mechanisms, we needed a task to isolate implicit adaptation. And a lot of the tasks in the literature, maybe some of you have worked with this before, is to use prism goggles to shift your world, disrupt what people see, and examine the motor errors people make and see how they correct for them. But if you're in this field, you'll also know that prism glasses, the way people correct them for these errors can be very conscious. They know that the world is shifted, and they know they have to consciously correct. And therefore, this method does not isolate implicit adaptation. So to isolate implicit adaptation, we had to develop a new task. And this task might seem a bit weird to you, but this became a very core part of my PhD. So in this task, imagine yourself seated in a dark room. You have a tablet that's recording your reaching movements. And what you see is a target on the screen and a cursor that represents your hand on the screen. You don't see your hand, but you see this cursor moving on the screen that represents your hand. And the instructions are very simple. Reach to the target. And so you can see people are able to do this during the baseline phase. X-axis is reaches over time, and y-axis is where you're reaching relative to the target. So during this baseline phase, people can reach very closely to the target. So people are very accurate. But critically, to artificially induce a motor error in the lab, we rotate this cursor to the left by 15 degrees. And critically, we instruct people to ignore this cursor, reach straight to the target. And indeed, no matter where you move, this cursor will always be moving 30 degrees to the left. And that's why we call it the clamped feedback test, because this cursor is clamped down at 30 degrees relative to the target. And people are aware of this. But despite these instructions, people can't seem to ignore this cursor. They seem to drift further and further away from the target in the opposite direction of this error, eventually reaching an asymptote of 20 degrees. And when you ask people, where do you think you're reaching? People would say, I'm reaching to the target. And so this change in behavior is implicit. Participants are not aware that they've drifted 20 degrees away from the target. So I want to pause here to see if there's any questions about that.
Everyone, thanks very much. Do you consider sensory dependency on it? Why, in this case, the information is given by vision. And I guess some people could focus on proprioceptive feedback more than visual one. What do you think? What's your opinion about that?
Yeah, perfect. I'll answer that question in a few slides. Yeah, completely. But this is a visual error, and people are seemingly adapting to that. And so where's proprioception? Yep. So yeah, isn't this weird? You have this error, you tell people to ignore it, yet people still seem to adapt in the direction as if they wanted to correct for this error, and they're not aware of this. So how do people understand the mechanism behind this process? When I first joined the lab, I call this the standard model in the field, what I call the visual-centric model. The error that you learn from is a visual error, the mismatch between the visual cursor and the target. But why do you hit an asymptote of 20 degrees? And by this visual-centric view, they say the reason you adapt to 20 degrees is because learning in response to the error is balanced by forgetting that's driving you back to the target. And this balance between learning that's driving you away and forgetting that's driving you back to the target is what makes you hit this asymptote of 20 degrees. But from a physical therapy background, this was very unsatisfying to me because I knew proprioception played a big role in controlling movements and helping people move. So I asked, where is proprioception in this model? It's missing. So I asked this very simple question. Where's proprioception? Where do people perceive their hand to be during implicit motor adaptation? And so to answer this question, I designed a very simple experiment. After every movement, participants are asked, based on a number wheel presented on the screen, where do you feel your hand to be under the table? Where do you think your hand is? So after they move, they see this wheel of numbers. If they think their hand is at the target, they would say 0. If they think it's to the left, they say -2, -3. If they think it's to the right, they say +1, +2. During this baseline phase, participants think their hand is at the target. Makes sense. They're reaching to the target. They think their hand is is at the target. And that's represented by a red, purple curve here. But critically, when we rotate this cursor away from the target and we say, where do you think your hand is? People start to think that their hand is biased towards the cursor by around 3 degrees. And that's represented here.
Sorry, JT.
Yeah.
you did say that when you ask participants, they say during the whole experiment, I was feeling my hand was straight at the target.
Mhm.
So the prediction here is that, and was that your prediction that you would find proprioceptive errors or whatever at 0 degree to stay at 0, or
That was my initial prediction because just based on just anecdotally, after every time we do this experiment, we say, hey, do you think you did anything different than reach to the target? People would say, no, I was just reaching to the target the whole time. So I predicted that people would think that their hand is always at the target. But in fact, during this initial phase, people think their hand is slightly biased towards the cursor. Not at the cursor. The cursor is 15 degrees. I'm sorry, 30 degrees. This is 3 degrees. Okay. So they think their hand is slightly away from the target. But as people adapt, start to drift further and further away from the target, their perceived hand position starts to realign back to the target, eventually also being even overshooting a little bit, but being near the target. And this is pretty much the time course of what happens. As people drift, their perceived hand position begins to start to realign back to the target. So this unique time course in which people perceive their hand to be initially biased towards the cursor and starting to realign back to the target inspired a new model of implicit adaptation. Rather than thinking that implicit adaptation is driven by visual error and then hitting an asymptote when learning equals forgetting, maybe implicit adaptation is driven by a proprioceptive error. And we can talk about terminology in a bit, but proprioceptive error here between the perceived hand position and the target. And this proprioceptive error might drive learning until people's perceived hand position is realigned back to the target. And we call this model PRIMO, the proprioceptive realignment model of implicit adaptation. So did I answer your question? So yeah, people, we call this, just a caveat, is we call this proprioceptive error, but I know some people can call it a perceptual error or a kinesthetic error. But what I mean specifically is just a perceived hand position with the target. That's the error that might drive implicit adaptation. So I want to pause here to see if there's any questions related to the idea.
I do have one. Do you think it makes me think of the rubber hand illusion, right?
Yeah.
And you have this proprioceptive drift happening. Do you think this is like similar mechanisms underlying it? And maybe would you see things differently if the cursor was a hand and not a cursor, not a spot?
Yeah.
And if you have some body ownership issues going on.
So that's exactly what I think is going on here. So the rubber hand illusion usually is passive to make you feel like your hand is the rubber hand. In this case, I would just say the big difference is that this is an active scenario. And in addition to that, it's the way you learn to move to correct for some error. In the rubber hand illusion, you're not typically asked to move nor correct for anything. But in terms of the mechanism, in terms of the multisensory integration process, completely very similar. And I'm borrowing that technology, if you will, to understand motor learning. What was your second question again?
It was the same.
It was the same, okay.
Yeah.
So how does this model work? But before that, I just want to emphasize that by this view, proprioception is no longer a hidden, neglected sense, but a key signal that drives implicit adaptation, just like it helps us with normal motor control. So I want to go a little deeper to demonstrate what this model is doing in terms of the multisensory integration process. So by this view, where do you perceive your hand? And where you perceive your hand is determined by where your hand actually is, from maybe the muscle spindle activity that's coming on. You see your hand, which is this visual cursor. And because this is movement, where you intend your hand to be, where I predict my hand to be. And this is assumed to be the target. And these three signals, the actual hand position, the cursor position, and where you predict your hand to be, combine to form one unified sense of where your hand is perceived And that results in a proprioceptive error, and that is what drives implicit adaptation. And specifically, the model formalizes this through some mathematics, just bringing in my kind of math background from undergraduate, which I never thought I would actually use anymore. It's kind of like that feeling of you bring high school geometry to some of your life that you never expected would happen. So this model formalizes this mathematically by saying that the actual hand position and the cursor position both first get attracted towards their predicted position, which is the target, which forms what I call the integrated hand and integrated cursor positions. And then these two modalities cross-modally attract. The hand gets attracted towards the cursor, what's called proprioceptive shift in the literature. And even vision gets calibrated by proprioception, what's called visual shift, to form what's ultimately perceived to be where your hand is. And so this is called sensory recalibration, but in general, all these senses with the prediction interact to give you one unified sense of where your hand is, and that results in a proprioceptive error, and that's what drives adaptation. Yes?
You mentioned earlier motor predictions based on the active movement that you made. Could you in your model discriminate between these proprioceptive signal versus this forward model that could arise from the active motion?
Yeah, so in our model, and there's ways to manipulate each without affecting the other, and we can get into that to dissociate them. But we assume that the motor prediction, because we ask you to reach to the target, so we assume that is constant based on the model at the target. And proprioception is the actual hand position is what's kind of moving. And yeah, vision is cursor, which is always constant as well in our experiment. So the only thing that's changing is your actual hand position. Yeah. So Primo, why is Primo useful? Well, Primo is useful because it can account for many phenomena in the literature. And one of these phenomena we already introduced before is that Primo not only can say, can account for the changes in hand position as people adapt to this 20-degree asymptote. But unlike the visual-centric model, it can account for where people perceive their hand to be, initially biased to the cursor and then gradual realignment back to the target. But in addition to Primo accounting for the perceived hand position, Primo also formalizes why people adapt to 20 degrees, and why might someone else adapt to 35, and why might someone else adapt to 5 degrees. Primo says where you adapt, this asymptote level, is determined by 3 factors. Number 1, how much noise you have in your proprioceptive system. Number 2, how much your proprioception is biased toward vision. And third is how noisy that your hand is at the top. And I want to show you some evidence for these 3 factors. So number 1, you can see that individuals with greater proprioceptive noise require a greater change in actual hand position to realign their perceived hand position back to the target. And you can see that correlation here. Individuals with greater proprioceptive noise have a greater asymptote. But you might be asking, how do we measure proprioceptive noise? And so in this case, I can tell you, I'll give you the demo first, and then I'll give you the actual version of what we do. So in terms of demo, I want you to, I want you to first watch me with your eyes open. Try to bring your right hand somewhere and bring your left hand tip to tip around 5 centimeters apart. Okay, so we can all do this very well with vision, and you can try to do this yourself. Okay, now I want you to close your eyes and do the same thing. Okay, so shake your hand, your right hand out, put it to a random position, and then try to bring your left hand tip to tip, but not touching, around 5 centimeters apart. And once you feel like you're ready, open your eyes. Okay, so some people are like this, some people are like touching, some people. So we're all a bit noisy. We're not perfect. And so we ask participants to do this around 100 times, and then we take the standard deviation of these reports. We do, okay, so that's the demo version. What we actually do is the experimenter move their hand somewhere, and the participant uses their mouse cursor to move a visual cursor to tell me where they think their hand is. And the standard deviation of these reports is their proprioceptive noise. So yeah, individuals with greater noise require greater change in hand angle to realign their perceived hand position to the target. So that supports Primo. I did my demo. The second is proprioceptive shift. So individuals with a greater bias in proprioception towards vision also require greater change in hand angle to realign their perceived hand position back to the target. And the way we measure proprioceptive shift is by asking me, it's the same task, but instead of looking at variability, looking at how their mean judgments are affected before and after introducing this visual rotation. Okay. And people actually show a bias in where they think their hand is towards vision by 3 to 5 degrees. So again, people with a greater bias towards vision, a greater proprioceptive shift, also have a greater asymptote. And furthermore, what's known in the literature is that proprioceptive shift seems to saturate around 5 degrees for larger and larger visual errors. So if I rotated the cursor by 30 degrees, 50 degrees, or even 70 degrees, people's bias in their proprioception towards vision seems to always just be around 5 degrees. But interestingly, if you look at the motor asymptote, where people asymptote for implicit adaptation, that also seems to saturate. So there's a nice correspondence between how much people are biased towards the cursor and how much people eventually adapt during implicit adaptation. Let me just show you one more data point. One thing we are finding more recently is that compared to younger individuals between 18 to 30, they reach an asymptote around 20 degrees, but older individuals, on average 65 to 75, actually implicitly adapt more. And this is often counterintuitive because oftentimes people think aging impacts implicit adaptation and can deteriorate implicit adaptation. But here we show an enhancement. And Primo allows us to ask, why is there this enhancement? Is it due to proprioceptive noise, sensory prediction noise, or even this bias towards vision? And we don't know the answer yet to this, but I am putting my money currently on greater proprioceptive shift, a greater bias towards vision with age. So to sum up, Primo, unlike previous visual-centric models, takes into account multiple sensory signals, not just vision, but also proprioception. And in addition, it takes into account your predictions about where your hand to be to form one unified sense of where you think your hand is, and use that signal to drive the way we move during motor learning. Any questions about part 1?
Do you have any idea about why there is this limit in proprioceptive shift to 5 degrees? Any explanation?
So there are 2 current views right now, and it's still debatable. And one view is that it's the idea of causal inference. When you want to bind signals to say, okay, this is a part of my body, this is not a part of my body, you want to make sure that the signal is relevant to your body. I don't think this backpack is informative to my body position. Only things that are kind of close to my body are informative to my body position. So when the cursor is rotated by 3 degrees, I should really think it's me. I should completely bind it. When the cursor is 30 degrees, I should kind of partially bind it. And when the cursor is 90 degrees, I should ignore it because it doesn't feel like it's me. And interestingly, the 30, 50, and 70 might be in that zone where it's all kind of partial binding. And that kind of results in some saturation. That's one view. Another view is it's just a fixed ratio. because maybe some neural mechanism saturates that says it can't bind it anymore. It says anything above 30, I'm just gonna treat it as the same. So we're still finding out which mechanism is the right one. Okay, so shifting gears. Then we asked, what is the neural correlates of implicit adaptation? And Fabrice, tell me if I'm running out of time. I can accelerate too. So what is the neural correlates of implicit adaptation? And for that, I want to turn to the next topic, the cerebellum's role in coordinating our actions and even our decisions. And let's first take a moment to really marvel at the cerebellum here. The cerebellum accounts for more than 80% of the neurons in our brain. And yet, it's oftentimes in the supplemental sections of our textbook. It's oftentimes removed and thrown away in many animal studies. But in fact, we should give it some respect because it has 80% of the neurons in our brain. What is it doing? And a lot of the work on the cerebellum first started in World War I, when the British soldiers had helmets that are not optimally designed to protect the cerebellum. And therefore, neurologists have been seeing a lot of gunshot wounds through the cerebellum, noticing that they have motor control deficits. Specifically, they have deficits in under and overshooting their movements, what's called cerebellar ataxia. So it's well known that the cerebellum plays a role in motor control. And the idea that's come out of that is that the cerebellum actually helps us predict the state of our body given a movement. What I said earlier are sensory predictions. And so I wanted to demo this through, Fabrice, can I demo it with you?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have?
Not prepared.
Oh, yeah, you have something. Does someone have a heavy object? Let's see.
This one?
Okay, perfect. Actually, I'll demo. You want to do my demo?
Yes.
Okay, so can you hold this out like this? Okay, hold it still. Okay, good. Now I want you to keep your hand as still as possible when I remove the cup from your hand, okay? Keep that still as possible. Okay, now try again. So notice what happens to her hand. Okay, so there's a bit of a upward movement. But now do it yourself. Okay. So the difference there is that when I removed it, you couldn't control herself, but when you removed it, then you can really keep it still. And the idea behind that is when you make a movement, your brain forms sensory predictions about what the consequences will be and cancels them out. The same way, and that's thought to be the role of the cerebellum, because when I move this way, I know I should stop here without requiring any sensory feedback, because I know given this motor command, I'll end up here and I should decelerate exactly at this right time. Without the cerebellum, you have to rely on slow sensory feedback. That's why you undershoot, overshoot, and have ataxia. So yeah, the cerebellum is thought to generate sensory predictions for a movement. How about the cerebellum's role in implicit adaptation? And what we know from the literature of involving more than 500 participants is that people with cerebellar ataxia or cerebellar degeneration show less implicit adaptation. And it's been unclear why the asymptote is reduced and why patients with cerebellar degeneration show this impairment. But Primo actually specifies a reason why. And it's not because proprioceptive noise is increased, because that seems fine. It's not because people with cerebellar degeneration show a greater bias towards vision, because that seems fine. It seems to be that people with cerebellar degeneration rely less on their sensory predictions. They have noisier sensory predictions, and therefore they rely more on proprioception from their hand, requiring less change in hand position to realign their perceived hand position to the target. So they actually rely more on sensory feedback, requiring less implicit adaptation to realign their perceived hand position to the target. So Primo provides a kind of integrates what we know from motor control and brings it into our understanding of implicit motor learning about the cerebellum's role in movement. So Primo provides a specific account for the cerebellum's role in implicit adaptation. But how about its role in cognition, in our decision making? And you might find this strange because maybe a lot of the things we know about cerebellum are motor control and motor learning. But in fact, the cerebellum is actually not just connected to M1, sensory motor cortex, but the cerebellum is actually connected to frontal cortex, forming these loops. So what is it doing for these more abstract components of our cognition? Furthermore, if we do an fMRI experiment, you can see that the cerebellum is not only active for right hand and left-handed presses. The cerebellum seems to be involved in working memory, autographical recall, math, reading a story, so on and so forth. The cerebellum seems to be involved in all of these high-level cognition tasks. So we see both anatomical and functional evidence for the cerebellum's role in cognition, but what is it doing? It's been difficult to understand how the cerebellum supports cognition. What are some theories about that? And so as a test of this, we posed the question to ask, maybe whatever the cerebellum is doing for motor control and motor learning, it's doing something analogous for cognition. Just like how the cerebellum is taking in a motor intent, generating some simulation to form a prediction about where the hand will be, to keep our actions well calibrated, maybe the cerebellum is doing something similar in the cognitive domain, taking in a cognitive intention, performing some covert mental simulation, generating a prediction to keep our decisions well calibrated. And why I like this mental simulation hypothesis is that it provides a falsifiable account for the cerebellum's role in cognition. And for the next few years in Pittsburgh at Carnegie Mellon, I'm aiming to in the next few slides. So the first piece of evidence we turned to ask whether the cerebellum performs mental simulations that support the explicit strategies that happen during motor learning. So let me describe what I mean. For a task to isolate explicit strategy, I did a very similar visual motor experiment, but it works a little differently. So in this task, participants again reach to the target. They get a cursor that's rotated away from the target by a large degree because we wanted this to be very explicit. We wanted participants to notice this error. And instead of asking people to ignore this cursor, we actually ask people to use this cursor, explore different movements to get this cursor to hit the target. So they actually have to explicitly, actively explore. And so in order to do this task well, people need to do some mental simulation of different action outcome associations in order to quickly reach in the direction to bring the rotated cursor to the target. And this link between mental simulation and success at this task has been well established in the literature. So if the cerebellum were involved in what I call the delayed feedback task, because one detail is we have to delay this feedback, just like in the rubber hand illusion, if you break the association, you make this very explicit that this is not your hand and you have to really use it as a tool. We predicted that patients with cerebellar degeneration would show impairments in this explicit strategy task. And that's indeed what we found. So let me describe these results to you. In the x-axis is reaches over time, and the y-axis is where people are reaching away from the target. And you can see that controls are able to find the 60-degree rotation solution fairly quickly to simulation and discover the 60-degree rotation solution. But in comparison, patients with cerebellar degeneration show a disrupted strategy discovery process. When we tell participants to turn off their strategy, both groups can do this, showing very little after effects, suggesting that this task is very explicit. And interestingly, when we ask both groups to recall the strategy that they already learned, both groups can do this very easily. So we find a dissociation here. We find that participants with cerebellar degeneration, that the cerebellum might play a selective role in strategy discovery, the phase that requires mental simulation, but not memory recall. So we asked, can we push this idea even further? Can we design a task that really taps into mental simulation? And to answer that question, we turn to a classic task called mental rotation. And in this task, it starts with a lot of mental simulation. And let's do some demos. So I want you all to participate here. I want you to judge if the letter that you see is in its normal or reversed orientation, if it were in its upright position. Okay? Normal. Reversed. Normal. Okay, great. So that's the task. And if you can kind of introspect a little bit, you might be kind of doing some covert simulation to kind of imagine this letter in its upright position to make that judgment. And that's the task. We use a button pressing task to minimize any motor requirements. Classically, the idea supporting mental simulation is that the amount of response time increases with the amount of rotation on this letter, as if people have to mentally rotate up to its upright position and make the judgment. So if the cerebellum were involved in mental simulation, then we would predict that patients with cerebellar degeneration would show an elevated reaction time slope, because this slope is indicative of the pace of mental simulation. So indeed, that's what we found. So compared to controls in the purple, showing a slope of 2 milliseconds per degree, patients with cerebellar degeneration show an elevated reaction time slope consistent with impaired mental simulation. But this might be due to just impairments on any cognitive task. So we performed a control task where we asked participants to memorize the sequence of dots in their locations presented on the screen. So they're both spatial. And they're probed on one of them to say, okay, is this dot the first one you see, the second one you saw, the third one you saw, so on and so forth. So it's a memory recall type of task. And you can see, compared to controls, cerebellar patients had the same slope. And the slope is thought to be the pace of searching through memory. And this dissociation, again, impairments on the mental simulation task, no impairments on the memory recall task, again, support the idea that cerebellum might play a selective role in mental simulation, not memory recall. We asked if, and these experiments were replicated within this paper twice. We wanted to push this idea even further to ask, is this mental simulation idea also applicable to another cognitive domain? So we turned to arithmetic, and I never knew my PhD would go from motor control to mathematics, but somehow that's what happened. And in that literature, it's been thought that people rely on what's called a mental number line to solve even simple arithmetic tasks. And the idea is that if I asked you 8 plus 9, that you position yourself at 8 and then you move 9 units using a spatial representation in your mind. And evidence supporting that also comes from reaction time. So if I ask you to add larger and larger numbers, your reaction time goes up, suggesting that maybe you are mentally simulating on this mental number line. So if the cerebellum were involved selectively in mental simulation, then we would expect, again, that patients with cerebellar degeneration would show an elevated reaction time slope. And indeed, that's what we found. So we did a verification task asking participants to verify whether 6 plus 7 equals 13, true or false. You can see both patients and controls, so controls and patients show a slope indicating the pace of moving on this mental number line. And you can see that patients have an elevated reaction time slope showing an impairment on this task. But you might be thinking, okay, is this just arithmetic in general, or is this actually a mental simulation deficit? And to answer that question, we had a control task. The same numbers, but now with multiplication. And in the literature, multiplication is thought to be more recall. Addition is thought to be more algorithmic mental simulation. So we expected no impairment on this memory recall task. Indeed, that's what we found. Compared to controls, patients showed the same slope. And again, this dissociation suggests that the cerebellum may play a selective role in mental simulation, that memory recall, again replicated in our paper and actually more recently again. So all this is to say that maybe the mental simulation hypothesis provides a holistic account for the cerebellum's role, not only in action, but also in cognition. Now, yep, please.
I was wondering, to which extent is your account different from that would be driven by an embodied cognition view on that? Because at least for the mental rotation, there's been, I think, some experiments showing that it involves a mental simulation of the hand movement itself. So in fact, the cognitive process would be motor in essence. And do you think your account explains differently that, or how do you differentiate cognition from motor in that sense?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think our...
And for the number line, I don't know actually if there has been also, because in that sense, the mental line seems more cognitive in essence, but the mental rotation is very motor.
Yeah. Really. So short answer is I don't know. I think our account currently, our hypothesis is related to things that feel more embodied, as well as things that are less embodied. And maybe it's more of a continuum, like the actual the first experiment about the explicit strategies to counteract the rotation feels maybe on the very embodied side. Then you have mental rotation kind of in the middle, and then you have the mental number line kind of towards this side. So I'm excited to test the constraints on this hypothesis to see if maybe things like language, certain parts of language that are maybe not as embodied, may also support this view, or it provides constraints on this view. But that's an interesting idea to pursue.
I think there are some accounts of the cerebellum's role in more high level language processes.
Yeah.
Actually, yes. So that would go in that direction.
Yeah, I would be really excited to kind of, if anyone has any ideas, because that's one direction I'm thinking about, language. And it's been hard to come up with a good test of the cerebellum's role in this dissociating stimulation and recall. So if someone has any ideas, I'm very, very excited to pursue those. Any other questions? So the last part of today's talk, I wanted to talk about the power of using online data to study motor learning. And I'm very excited about this area because I feel like it opens a lot of doors to scale up our research. And the studies I've talked about so far, especially the ones in terms of movement, often involve 20 participants. And we're very familiar with this heuristic of 20, 16, but somewhere in that range for our studies. And the reason for that is quite simple and reasonable. Our equipment is very expensive. We also want to really capture people's movement in detail. And that constrains our experiments. But we can still ask the question, can we understand motor learning even with the trackpad, with the mouse, with things that are accessible at home, allowing us to scale up our studies to not just 20, but now 2,000 participants. And what is the power of doing that? We were a bit forced to do that over COVID, but that idea was brewing already before COVID, and kind of COVID accelerated this. And if you're interested in doing the study, here's the link, and Fabrice could probably send it out to everyone if you're interested. So let's take a look at the data. And first, I want to show you how large data sets can reproduce classic effects. We want to make sure that this method is valid. Similar to the previous graphs I've shown before, x-axis is time, y-axis is where people are moving, and 45 is the solution. They have to counteract this 45-degree rotation. And you can see participants are able to learn. So these are the average of around 2,000 people. And when I tell them to turn off their strategy, they show an after effect. So very much reproducing the classic motor learning effects in the literature, from prism adaptation to anything I've showed you earlier. If I ask people to come back for a next section, they adapt faster and they show less after effect. And this is the classic effect of savings, in which people can quickly recall what's worked in the past and quickly counteract the rotation. So all this is to say that these online methods, even though people are doing this at home in their pajamas, we're able to kind of reproduce classic learning effects. But in addition to this, here's another one. So compared to people learning with one target, some people reach to 2 targets, and we show that people who learn with 2 targets learn slower, but show more after effect. And this is what's called contextual interference. I'm happy to elaborate on this idea. And I think it's actually quite a prevalent idea in sports psychology, actually. Practicing multiple things at once slows down learning, but increases retention. But in addition, large data sets allow us to reconcile controversial findings. So imagine yourself in 2002 with 73 individuals asking about what is the effect of age. And this study showed no effect of age in motor learning from 20 to 75 years old. You can imagine every group probably has around 10 individuals. But when we look across 2,000 individuals, we can see that there is a subtle inverted U effect of age across different phases of adaptation. So if you were to sample a few individuals across this inverted U effect, maybe you would have missed some subtle but interesting effects of age on motor learning. And this is only possible if you have a fairly large and rich data set. These large data sets also provide normative data. So for example, if you had a patient coming in, or if you had someone with a different age coming in, you can match them. So these are 3 different phases of learning. And you can see there's interesting distributional changes across these 3 phases. And these provide normative data such that you can place and maybe rank people coming in the future. And this applies to reaction time, movement time, and also some other kinematic measures as well. Large online data sets also allow us to build machine learning models to make predictions about who will be successful or who will adapt more during our tasks. So to do this, we ask people to answer a survey about, who they are, did they enjoy the experiment, where they come from, so on and so forth. And we found that interesting constraints in predicting someone's ability to learn. So for example, people's visual ability seems to modulate the amount they learn. So people with impaired vision learn less than people with impaired vision, but they show no differences in this after effect. Maybe because vision implicits more explicit strategies, but not implicit processes. This is my favorite finding, even though I don't have a great causal mechanism. But if you came out the study saying 5 out of 5, I enjoyed this experiment, you adapted more. If you're someone who said, I hated this experiment, I won't come back, 1 out of 5 stars, you adapted less, but no difference in the after effect phase. So maybe motivation, modulating explicit strategy, or vice versa. You left the experiment feeling good because you did well. You see some interesting sex and gender differences on the late adaptation phase, but not during the after effect phase. Furthermore, we found some constraints on the after effect phase, the more implicit phase. So how variable you move during baseline seems to determine how much after effect you see. I'm happy to elaborate on any of these because each of them has their little own controversy behind them. I'll skip this one, but where people are moving, so half the subjects got a target in the diagonal direction, half the subjects got a target in the cardinal direction, and that seems to really modulate the amount people show in the after effect. People in the diagonal targets show greater after effect than people in the cardinal targets. And this was the biggest effect in our data set, which is typically ignored and averaged over in our typical motor learning experiment. So this is all to say On Point, which is this online framework to do motor learning, provides a new powerful tool for studying how humans adapt, acquire, and retain skill movements. And this might be relevant for any of you who are interested in left-handers, easily recruit left-handers online. And I just want to show of hands, who's left-handed? All right, 3 out of 25, perfectly around 10%, which is basically the population. So if you're interested in left versus right hemisphere, left versus right hand, it's just harder to recruit in person, but online, everywhere. You can also very much select kind of who you want to, what geographically, where you want to involve people, which is a more diverse representative sample. But so to summarize, today I talked about the role of proprioception in motor learning, the cerebellum's role in coordinating not only our actions, but also our cognition, and the power of using online data to study motor learning. But why is this all important? And I think all this research is important for 3 main reasons. One is that the types of phenomena and models we reveal about motor learning, being a very observable and quantifiable form of learning, may generalize to other forms of learning, like learning languages, like learning perception, so on and so forth. So maybe we can generalize the concepts and the principles in motor learning to other domains of psychology as well. Second is what we learn here in terms of the theoretical components of motor learning may help us inform the design of brain-machine interfaces to help people train to use these robots, these prostheses, to help them move in the future. And lastly, in terms of sports psychology, how to optimize human performance through coaching and through optimal feedback. And with that, if we have a few more minutes, I can go into future directions, or I can pause here. Okay, I'll just spend maybe 2 minutes on what I'm excited about for the future. So I'll be at Carnegie Mellon. So now I'm a postdoc at Cambridge University in the UK, but next in June, I'll be arriving at Carnegie Mellon, a place very fertile for motor control, motor learning. So if you're ever in the area, please don't hesitate to reach out and say hi. The lab will be primarily focused on 2 topics. One is advancing computational and neural mechanisms of motor learning. And 2 is advancing theories of how the subcortex, like the cerebellum and basal ganglia, are involved in cognition and action. So I want to ask questions like, what is the causal role of proprioception in motor learning? 2, how are complex motor skills learned? Not just simple reaching movement, but more naturalistic, complex motor skills. And 3, how does motor learning progress across long time scales, like months, years, not just minutes to hours? In terms of the cerebellum, I want to understand the cerebellum's involved in mental simulations for other forms of cognition, like social cognition, language, and maybe things that are non-embodied. Second, what are the constraints on cerebellar dependent mental stimulation? So the embodiment is one, but maybe the timing is important, like it has to be a short time scale, not about long time scale. And third, what is the cerebellum's role in not just motor learning, but also reinforcement learning and perceptual learning, other forms of learning? Does it also play a role? So I'll give you a flavor of these three, just very briefly. But what is the causal role of proprioceptors on motor learning? That's in collaboration with Fabrice. We've done some work on working with patients with deafferentation. I'm sure you heard a lot about this in this department. But we work with individuals like WL who don't feel where their body is without vision. And you can see that she even accidentally hits her face when I ask her to make these simple reaching movements, because with her eyes closed, she doesn't know where her body is. And so we've asked how people like WL do on our motor learning tests and where they feel their hand to be. We have one thing I'm also really excited about, and this relates to the question, like, why do we feel it's so automatic to type or play piano, things like that. So we have a new theory about this. I'll be happy to go into detail if someone's interested, but we call it the 3R framework. First, we have to reason about action-outcome relationships. Second, we have to then refine our movements. So even though we understand the relationship, like how the handlebars control the wheel, we now have to make sure the movement parameters are optimal. And lastly, we have to retrieve these parameters based on the context. I'm in this context, I quickly do this. I'm in this other context, I have to quickly do that. And that's what expertise is possibly made of, is people who are in this retrieval stage. And I want to show you one example of how complex motor skills might be proceduralized. I'm really excited to use markerless hand tracking using just a webcam. So you can just log into this website. I ask you to make different movements with your hand, and I'm able to capture these movements and in this gamified manner. So you can't really see it when you're feeding a cat some fish by making different movements with your hand. And for the participant, they can also learn some sign language along the way. And lastly, how does motor learning progress over long time scales? I was talking to a student here who is interested in Counter-Strike, but oftentimes when you learn first-person shooting video games, you can practice with targets on the screen like this. So people's moving their mouse to hit these targets. And the benefit of this is we don't need to really incentivize people to participate. They just come back for the experiment, not just across 1 or 2 hours, but actually across 100 days of motor learning. So you can see how learning, how many targets people hit per second increases like this across not just 1 day, which is our typical motor learning experiment, across 100 days. And you can ask kind of really cool questions about the progression of different skills across these time scales. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to take any more questions.
I have a question. You've exposed the convenience of having online data and what are the advantages of that. Can you tell us a little bit more about the inconvenience from the data?
Yeah. So there are several issues with online data. Some of them probably not so surprising, but without the experimenter being there, you can't be sure what the participant is doing. There are ways to decrease the possibility of the participant not doing exactly what you ask, and that is by checking their attention, by doing various questions throughout the experiment, and instruction checks to be like, do you understand these instructions, and can you repeat the instructions back to me? That being said, what this taught me is that we should be doing this for in-person experiments as well. Too often in person, when we see things are not going too well, we intervene And that creates sometimes differences across participants. The online experiment format doesn't give you an opportunity to do that. And therefore, in a way, it kind of makes it cleaner. Everyone gets the same instruction, everyone's kind of receiving the same type of input. But adding in those instruction attention checks would certainly increase the amount of the possibility of people doing random things when they're in their bedroom just playing your game. The other has to do with oh yeah, I remember now. The other has to do with timing. So if you need to get down to the millisecond level, if your effect is 10 milliseconds, 20 milliseconds, you might run into issues because mouse, trackpad, presentation of stimuli on the screen all have delays. And so just if your effect size is above 100 milliseconds, very feasible. If your effect is within the 10 to 30 millisecond range, I'll be careful with online experiments. I'll just add one more data point to this. It's interesting, mouse versus trackpad. Mouse is a whole arm or like maybe a wrist movement. Trackpad is kind of a finger movement. We actually don't see any differences across mouse versus trackpad, which was very surprising to us when we first started this endeavor. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the super inspiring talk. I have a specific question on this proprioceptive noise, which I understood is a very important component of this adaptation process. Is it like inbuilt? Is it like hardwired, or is it something that is flexible, that can be modified by training, expertise, things like that? And is it domain general? I have two questions. Is it general to all skills, or is it specific to a given motor skill or a given effector?
Yeah. So first question, is it flexible? And I think it is. And one data point for this that I didn't show, and I'm still wrapping my head around why, but a colleague of mine has shown that during baseline, your proprioceptive noise, let's say, is 5 degrees. But when I introduce a visual motor discrepancy, your proprioceptive noise, in theory, I thought would stay constant. But in this training, if you will, in response to a visual proprioceptive discrepancy, when I bring you out of that context and ask you to judge your hand position, noise actually increases. So within even the short manipulation to tell you to ignore this cursor, the noise actually is already modulated. And I think there's a lot of research in the opposite direction too, where you train vision using, train proprioception using vision, and you can see the noise reduce. I don't know how long the retention is, but all that is to say it's very flexible. So I would say that the proprioceptive judgments we have in our task are on the perceptual level. You probably bring in priors about where you think your hand is, and maybe that is what's being modulated. If you had a needle in the mechanoreceptors to measure the sense of proprioception, the signals, I imagine that won't be effective, but that's to be determined. Your second question relates to
Whether it's general or
yeah. Okay. So short answer is I don't know, but I would think it's domain general. But it might manifest in different ways. So the behavioral consequences might be different. In this task, worse proprioceptive noise means greater implicit adaptation because you need greater change in hand angle to realign perceived hand with the target. I can imagine, for example, a force field adaptation task. So you reach the target, but your hand gets pushed away from the target. There's no visual feedback. In this task, learning is how much you can push back equal and opposite against the force to get your hand to the target. In this situation, worse proprioceptive noise by the model, Primo, suggests you adapt less. So I want to test that. But that's all that is to say that proprioception, I think, is very important across all tasks that will manifest a bit differently.
one. So your first papers highlight the role of proprioception in motor learning. And then we thought it would be a good idea to look at patients. And the patients who are deprived of proprioception, they look, at least at the behavioral level, quite similar to normals. So when there is a visual rotation, they seem to learn just like normal. So is that just a poor approach, or
Yeah.
what do you think?
So, yeah.
It doesn't highlight the role of proprioception when we study motor learning, although you showed the problems in motor control.
Yeah, so Fabrice and I were very surprised. So back to the question of proprioception noise. One prediction we had was that individuals like WL without proprioception would show increased proprioceptive noise, and therefore they would adapt more. Right? They would show enhanced adaptation. We didn't find that in this paper. We actually found that they adapted the same. And so there's two possibilities. One, the model that I proposed is limited, needs modification. Something about people without deafferentation, something about us in this movement that you generate to bring your hand away from the target. The signals that are coming back might not just be from proprioception. Maybe there's more efferent signals about your hand moving that is signaling to us and signaling to her that she has moved enough to realign the perceived hand to the target. So all that is to say, maybe we're missing a key signal, an efferent signal that's also conveying hand position to the participant. The other possibility is that the model is correct, but for some reason, for people without proprioception across a lot of their lifetime, there's some compensatory mechanism at play that might upweight proprioception that's left in her and decrease the relative weight in other signals. I'm not sure, but one experiment that I want to do to test this out in people with proprioception is by vibrating the muscle tendon, creating a transient increase in proprioceptive noise. I would predict that they would implicitly adapt more.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for coordinating.
J'y vais, tu vois. C'est gentil. Etienne. Voici.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why I think I should revisit that. I should definitely remember.
For old people.
Carl Friston, like I read his papers.
Yeah,
Wow.
There is a lot of interest.